workshop. My name is Joanna Woronkowicz, and I'm one of the faculty directors for the Center for Cultural Affairs. And this is obviously the Workshop in Cultural Affairs series, our third presentation / interview for the semester. So today I have the pleasure of doing a live interview with one of my colleagues and friends, Professor Michael Rushton. And Professor Rushton is also a faculty director here at the Center for Cultural Affairs and on faculty with me here at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. And perhaps I will just give you a brief minute to introduce yourself, Michael, for everybody who doesn't know you, and then I will start going with the interview. Does that sound good?
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you, Joanna, and thank you so much to everybody who has come here. This book was something of a labor of love, and I'm glad that there are so many people interested in finding out a bit more about it. A little bit about me. I've been here at Indiana University since 2006. I'm originally from Canada, growing up on the West Coast in British Columbia. And my degrees are from there. I'm an economist by training, although this is very much not an economics book. In fact, there is one chapter devoted to the economic approach to public funding for the arts, but only one chapter. And the other chapters are really sort of counterpoints to that, different views and so on. So I've sort of broadened my horizons since graduate school, I can put it that way. I've worked in the field of cultural affairs for more than 25 years. I started out as a tax policy and labor economics economist, but when I found out that there were people who actually studied the arts and culture from an economic point of view, I couldn't resist. And so I've done that for a very, very long time. And so this book was published in the summer by Palgrave Macmillan. I was happy to go with Macmillan because a major character in the book, and in fact, from the first to the last chapter, is John Maynard Keynes, and of course Macmillan was Keynes's publisher, and so I think, well, great, this is very nice. So I'll just say that by way of introduction, but I will let Joanna pose the questions.
Great. Thank you, Michael, and everyone who's here. This is a little bit of a different format than what we usually do. So it doesn't need to be me doing all of the talking and all of the questioning. I would welcome everybody's questions in the chat or raise your hand. So this can be a discussion among all of us. But I do have obviously a lot of questions that I want to get started with for Michael. So I have the book right here. In case you don't have it, I have a signed copy. So when the author received his, he came by my office and gave me a signed copy. So I dug right into it. So I've had the enjoyment of kind of looking at it, reading it, trying to figure out what it means for me, trying to figure out why you wrote it. And I've come up with a lot of questions that I'm interested in, but I'm sure will probably provoke some more questions among even you or the audience. So I think what I'm going to start with is just saying what I think to be the main research question of this book, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. But obviously the title maybe gives it away, but I think that main research question is, how can we morally justify public funding for the arts? Is that right? Or is there a larger, broader question that you tried to answer with this book?
No, I really did try to capture it in the title, in that I want to look at how can we justify this. On the very first pages of the book, I give the example of the Cleveland Symphony, and I outline how much money the National Endowment for the Arts, the Ohio Arts Council, and the local Cuyahoga Arts and Culture give to the orchestra every year, and it's a sizable amount, all combined well over $1 million a year, to a fairly rich organization that performs for a better off audience. And I just start with the basic question of, well, the people who pay taxes for this, the people who fund this, are for the most part people who don't attend the orchestra or even listen to classical music at all in any form, whether digital or live. Many of these people, since it comes out of general taxation, are not very well off. So can we come up with reasons that say, yes, but we should do this anyway? I should say, when I teach public policy in the arts, I give my students as their very first assignment before the first day of class to give me a 1-paragraph answer to the question, is the funding for the Cleveland Symphony justified? And I tell them, don't do any research, don't search for a right answer, just tell me what you think in your gut about this question. And then at the end of the semester, I get them to revisit it. But it's a good starting point for them in the course, and I think it's a good starting point in the book. How do we morally justify this allocation of public funds?
So I think to many of us on the call, we probably see why that question seems interesting, seems important, but maybe to others, it seems like a question that shouldn't even be considered. So I guess my question to you is, why do you actually think this question is important?
I think it's important for 2 reasons, and I guess they're the 2 reasons I wrote the book. One is just purely the intellectual reason. Can we sort of formulate a good, rational answer to this question without hand waving, without making claims about, art is good, so we should do this, but actually really digging in and saying, okay, can we come up with something fairly cohesive, fairly persuasive, that gives a solid answer to this question? And so I think just intellectually, and for our students and for our readers and scholars, it's important that we really think carefully about this question, because it's not an easy question. It's not as easy as people think it is. And very reasonable, smart people can disagree on the answer to it. And in fact, they can come up with very different kinds of answers in favor of funding, which is another thing I discuss. I think the second reason is more of a pragmatic one, which is that if you look at sort of the public discussion around this, if you read various articles that come up on artsjournal.com and places like this, you see a lot of fairly weak reasoning. A lot of things that aren't very strong. And last week, Americans for the Arts released yet another one of their ridiculous, economic impact, national prosperity in the arts studies. And you think, well, no, this doesn't hold any water at all. If we're going to argue in favor of public funding for the arts, we need something better than that. We need something that really can convince at a rational level.
Yeah, that's what I got from you in the book, especially from your approach in arguing with these different moral philosophies, which we'll kind of touch on in a minute, was that this is a complicated question to try to figure out. And there doesn't seem to be a really strong argument in any way that the argument has been made to this point. Would you agree with that statement?
I think there's more can be done to clarify things. There are different kinds of ways to justify public funding for the arts. So one can be an economist and say, well, there is economic analysis of public goods and external effects, and these can give arguments in favor of public funding for the arts. But one can also be very opposed to the economic method right from the start, think it's incorrect, and yet still come to a conclusion that we ought to have public funding. I would say you can have the communitarian critique, say that comes from Charles Taylor or Michael Sandel. They reject the economic approach to public policy, but they find a different way to say, and yet it is important that we support culture. Now they come up with different implications for how we should do that. But it doesn't mean they're opposed to it. And this is one of the things I wanted to explore, is that you don't have to have one particular philosophical viewpoint to come to a conclusion in favor of, or in fact against, public funding of the arts.
So how do you strip politics from your arguments? When you talk about moral philosophies, it doesn't really bring up the idea of politics and what politics does to color the arguments either way for public funding. So do you consider politics and what side people fall on in terms of the political spectrum when you are making these arguments or analyzing these philosophies? Is it inherent in these philosophies, or is it in no way present at all?
That's a good question. I think there's two ways I can answer it. My way is to say, and I'm characterizing here, I'm just above all that. So I'm trying to say, here are different philosophical arguments in favor of this, but I'm not going to get into what we have right now in 2023 in terms of politics and the arts and cultural funding and the way to think about that. And so it's not that these aren't important considerations, and public choice considerations, of course, have a big influence on arts funding and how it's funded. I don't deny it. But it's not really, I don't really dig into that as my subject matter, because I really want to say, okay, what are these justifications? What are the justifications for it beyond what a politician of one party or another, or an advocate for one party or another might say? So that's my answer. I understand the critique that would say, well, you can't do that. You can't do that because the philosophies that I'm trying to give are in fact very political from the start, and you can't get around that. And so in one of my chapters, I tried to deal with what I could call philosophical conservatism. Not the conservatism I would see in political parties today, but sort of the long tradition going back to Burke and Coleridge and through T.S. Eliot and Michael Oakeshott and so on, and how they would approach public funding for the arts. And I try to treat that as something separate from what a contemporary 2023 person who identifies as conservative would say, because it might be quite different. A criticism of me might be to say, well, those intellectual conservatives I cite are actually no different from political conservatives, except that they use more four-syllable words. But otherwise, they're doing the same thing, which is to justify social and economic hierarchies and their preservation and nothing else. So I get that criticism. I think I even cite that criticism in the book, but I do try to take a different approach.
Yeah, and I see that when reading it. It's a sobering approach from my perspective, because it is such a conscious effort to separate the topic from how we normally see it in context, which is generally in a pretty politically charged context. Then there's the issue of your selection of the moral philosophies themselves. So you discuss the economic method, which I love how you start the book off with that, because it's sort of first and foremost what I think of Michael Rushton arguing for and talking about with regard to, the answer to the question, but also liberalism, egalitarianism, communitarianism, conservatism, and multiculturalism. So the very selection of these moral philosophies, in my opinion, sort of gives us an idea, or at least a hint of what you might think as an individual, or where your politics lies. Would you agree with that or not agree with it?
I'll agree in part. I think I wanted to cover the ground. Now, first of all, it is selective in that it is Western philosophy and it is Anglophone philosophy. My French remains at high school level, even though I'm Canadian, and I am simply not knowledgeable enough about European continental philosophy or Eastern philosophy to be able to say very informed or intelligent things about it. So this is very much a sort of Anglo-American view of moral philosophy. That's the only thing I'm actually capable of writing about. And so, I have to apologize in advance that that's what I know. The second thing I tried to do is I didn't want to exclude things because I didn't like them. I included philosophies where at least some authors had made a real attempt to talk about public funding for the arts within that literature. So that is how I sort of did that selection. So, for example, in the chapter on liberalism, where at the heart of it is John Rawls and his theory of justice, he is explicitly opposed to public funding for the arts. He says it in black and white, gives his reasons why. And I thought, well, this has to be addressed. I mean, we can't ignore this, hugely influential work of political theory. And so it would be an incomplete book without that. Likewise, the communitarians, they also address this. And Charles Taylor he gives very specific examples about why local orchestras should be funded and why we should have different cultural policies and so on. So I tried to select any philosophy that I thought where there were sort of prominent authors who within that tradition had really had a go at the question of why and how we should have public funding for the arts. And so that's how that selection was. It can't just be what I agree with because, as you know, many of the people in this book sharply disagree with each other. And so one could not agree with everything that is put forward. The other thing I would say in this context, and I think this is important, is that I do not advocate for any one particular moral philosophy. And I think that's important to know. So nowhere in the book do I say, and that's why you should be a utilitarian or anything like that. There's nothing like that there. I really just try to take these different philosophies as they've been presented by their own advocates and look through the implications of what are they saying about public funding for the arts and why, and what can we say about this, and what are the implications, what are the maybe unstated assumptions, what are possible critiques, but to take each of them on their own.
And I want to get back to that, but first I want to ask you, I mean, when you're reading through the book, it's an incredibly rich discussion. And honestly, the perspective a reader gets is, wow, Michael Rushton is really well read. So I'm wondering, can you just describe a little bit how you got to not only wanting to answer this question, but to the point that you could even know what was out there to select in terms of these different moral arguments, how to analyze? I mean, has this been years of your work that you have been continuing to try to reflect on this question? Just a little bit about your process would be really, I think, illuminating for us.
Okay, that's a very delicate way of saying I'm old. I've worked on this for many, many years. And so, you can go back. I have an article in the Journal of Cultural Economics from over 20 years ago on methodological individualism and cultural economics, where I say, the economic method, this was addressed to economists, but I said the economic method carries with it a lot of assumptions about how the world works and how we should think about policy. And it's important to know that if we start to question some of those assumptions, we start to come to some very different sorts of results in terms of what we can say about public funding. The economic method carries a lot with it. In some policy circles, it's sort of taken for granted, but I think, the method of individualism, the method of taking preferences as given it's a very, a strong approach, but it is something that needs to be sort of clarified and really set out what are all the implications of this. So I guess getting back to your question, I've done this for a long time. And from the beginning, when I started doing, I think I wrote my first cultural economics paper in 1996 or so. But from the beginning, when you think about it, sort of the question that overhangs everything is, why should there be public funding for the arts? If anybody on this call, and I know there's people on this call who teach courses in arts policy, you have to address that question. It's sort of the big umbrella question over so much that you're going to do is, why would we do this? Why do we have a national endowment for the arts at all? Sorry, Sunil. But it has to be asked, right? And so so that question is always there, and it forces you to kind of think about it. And so through the years, I've tried to look at, okay, if I depart from sort of my home base of economics, what do I find out there? And that was sort of what led my search through this. Now, some things are very new. So in the chapter on egalitarianism, for example, I look at the question of the capabilities approach, which is, a sort of from Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, a fairly new attempt to look at how should we think about equality. It can apply to arts policy. I see Andrew Zitzer is on the call, and he wrote just a tremendous paper with his colleagues on trying to apply the capabilities approach to thinking about arts funding. But so some of the things are newer and some of the things came later on. But I've sort of always been working on this, and my students will know that I've shaped my course through the years in terms of always examining this. I not only write things, but I also teach things in part to try to figure things out for myself. It's sort of a secret I might not tell my students, but often I put something on the syllabus because I want to puzzle it out as well as them. And so it leads me to look at all of these different approaches.
I think I have one more question about just the general structure and frame of the book before we get into content. And then I also really want to invite our audience members to put in some questions in the chat. Again, anything I can pull from what you're saying in the chat, or if you want to ask the question yourself. But my last question is what you end up choosing and how you structure the book. I mean, how big of is it the whole picture, or are there pieces of the picture that we're missing when it comes to the rationalizations for public funding for the arts? And what are those pieces of the picture that we might be missing?
Okay, just so I'm clear on the question. So sort of when I've done all of these, sort of what things do I think is missing in the general dialogue?
When you exactly when you think about what are the potential rationalizations for public funding for the arts or not public funding for the arts, are you getting the whole picture when you read this book, or are there pieces that you know are missing that you just didn't want to cover because it wasn't your area? You don't think it relates to the other types of content you were analyzing. So are there pieces that you think that aren't discussed that would be important to just know as a reader?
Yeah, I tried to be as comprehensive as I could. And as I said earlier, I did not get into the politics. I really wanted to stay with the sort of moral rationalizations for this and different ways of approaching it. I think in each chapter that I wrote, and this is true, and anybody who's ever written a book knows this, for each chapter that I wrote, there are 10 books potentially inside that one chapter. And so, different subtle arguments end up being dealt with sort of very briefly, and a painting with some fairly broad brushstrokes. But I am trying to capture the whole landscape, even if abstracting over a lot of details, more impressionist than realist.
Great. Well, then let me get into some questions that are a little bit more about the arguments that you analyze, and then some of your critiques of those arguments, which, by the way, that was probably one of the kind of the nicest things about reading the book, is the logical way in which you counter some of these arguments that come out of these moral philosophies. And Sunil just made a really nice comment in the chat about that very same point. He says the book's section on methodological individualism and the critiques that have been leveled by communitarianism and Michael's response to those critiques is itself worth checking out. So I totally agree on that.
Thank you.
So thanks, Sunil. So if you could just take a look at the span of these moral arguments that you include, are there ones that are stronger than others for rationalizing public funding for the arts? Or are there ones that are stronger than others for rationalizing not publicly funding the arts?
Okay, well, let me that is I think the big question. So let me try to this will be a long answer. Put it that way. It is the most strongest statement against public funding comes from Rawls and comes from liberalism. And his contention, and again, my apologies for being so broad on this, are simply that it is not the government's job or the state's job to try to tell people these are things you should pursue as the good things in life. These are other things you should avoid. We will use public resources to try to steer you towards these good things. And that is what he says that in his social contract that we would choose, we would not want to see happen, because we would never want to give the state so much power as to try to essentially, to use the often phrase, nanny us towards what is good for us. And so he is also strongly egalitarian, that that inequalities are only justified insofar as they can benefit the worst off. And so when he comes to actually discussing funding for the high arts, he says, I can't find a reason on any grounds for doing this. It neither fosters a more equal society, and it violates that basic principle that it is up to individuals themselves to decide what is good, whether the cultural life is worth pursuing or not. And so that question is always out there. And any other philosophy that tries to say, yes, we should have public funding for the arts, has to know that that critique is out there, and that they are going against it. It doesn't mean everybody has to agree with Rawls. In fact, I don't agree with them. But it's a critique that we have to take seriously. And it also has a big implication for public funding of the arts, because even if we disagree with Rawls's conclusion, within his argument is something which is true, which is that when we do public funding for the arts, we actually, the state is actually making a statement that this is good, right? The arts are good, and people should pursue them. And furthermore, these funded arts in particular, we think are worthy of pursuit, are good for people, and should be encouraged, and makes for a better society and makes for individual lives. I think it's good that we are honest in acknowledging that we don't try to deny this. And I don't. One of the criticisms that often comes from books like this is that the conclusion is weak, and I'm going to plead guilty. I don't say a lot in my conclusion. But one of the things I do say in my conclusion is that any arts funder has to be sort of honest in that respect. That yes, we are actually making a values statement here. We are actually saying this is good, this is worth funding, this is good for people. We are not simply saying that individuals should be, left adrift on their own to decide what's right, but we actually do want to favor something. And I think it's important to say that. When we get to, well, people who say we should fund the arts, now here we get into different kinds of philosophers who say we should. The communitarians say, well, the very way that we see the world, the very way that we form our values, has come out of our common culture, and that cannot be ignored. And we cannot, as the economists do, simply say, well, we just have these cultural preferences that are just sort of there. So the communitarians really stress, well, they're not just there. They were formed by the culture itself. You have this sort of circle. And so it is difficult to treat public goods like arts funding in the same way you might treat public goods like, say, a flood control project, which is fairly uncontroversial because nobody likes floods. Culture is something different. And so we have that. We also have the conservative approach that says, beyond that, there are certain things from our past in our civilization that are simply worth preserving and are worth enhancing, even if it is not universally enjoyed, even if it does tend to be enjoyed by something of an elite. That there is value in this beyond what people's preferences might be, what ordinary pop culture consumers might think, and that this is worth preserving. The conservative chapter I wanted to write because we have, I think, sort of an interesting situation where, even though I don't talk about politics, it's generally the case that political parties in 2023, conservative parties are not that keen on government funding for the arts. You always have Republicans in the United States, at least a few, saying we should defund the National Endowment, until it actually gets down to a vote on defunding the National Endowment, and then they change their mind, because of course they don't really want to do that. but at least they make those kinds of words that, this is not an appropriate expenditure. This is not the government's business, and so on. And I wanted to write the conservatism chapter because in many ways, they come up with very strong arguments in favor of public funding for the arts, that this is something that has to be preserved, that in our economy, the way it is evolved in terms of our very capitalist, individualist economy, we need some anchors in place to preserve this culture. This goes all the way back to the poet Samuel Coleridge. And so they actually have quite a strong case for public funding, and public funding that entails various sorts of informed judgments as to what constitutes quality in the arts.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. So James brings up a really good question, because you keep on using the term the arts, and I think that there's probably a particular conception of what that term means. Maybe different philosophers use different conceptions, but James asks, do the various arguments in favor of public funding tend to have a common definition or conception of what is meant by the arts? Are we talking about the Western fine arts here, or something different?
Yeah, it's I mean, if we stick to the West for now, I think in general, when most people address this, they address the fine arts. Nobody is saying that it is going to be important at this moment in time that we give assistance to Taylor Swift and her fans. They seem to do all right. And so it is I generally tried to write the book towards, well, what are the things we do fund, right? So this seems like a kind of a hand-waving argument in terms of defining the arts. But in terms of, well, we generally leave some art forms simply to the market, commercial music and film and so on. But sort of what are the art forms that we would typically find subsidized? And I know that seems backwards the way I'm defining it, but I'm defining it in terms of, well, this is the question people are generally trying to address within this topic.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about public funding for the arts, at least from reading the book, it sounds like you're speaking about the sort of a direct subsidy for the arts. Are you talking about direct subsidies only, or are you talking about also other types of indirect subsidies, or even non-subsidies, things like zoning for a cultural district, or other types of efforts that obviously incentivize arts and cultural development, but aren't necessarily the products of subsidization?
Yeah, I tend to focus on direct grants because with direct grants, you have the state more or less saying, these are the particular artists or arts organizations that we are choosing to subsidize. And so there's that element of choice. When we have indirect policies like, say, tax credits for film production or music recording or video production, I see those, I've always seen those as more industrial policy rather than arts policy, because there the funding is simply go make something and we will give you a tax break for that. And we're not looking at the content, we're not looking at the quality. I've always gotten a kick out of the fact when the legislature and government of the state of New Jersey found out the size of subsidies they were giving for the filming of Jersey Shore by MTV in their jurisdiction. I'm not looking at that because I see that as that's not really arts policy at all. That's simply what are policies that can give employment to camera operators and sound engineers and people like that. And so I think direct funding from sort of your traditional direct funding from arm's length arts councils is a limited view of arts funding, but I have a purpose in mind with that, in that it is people deciding through various adjudication processes, this is what we think ought to be funded. And that's where arguments about moral foundations, I think, are strongest.
So Andrew Itzitzer brings up maybe another moral foundation that you didn't include, but he talks about effective altruism. So the idea that the spending fund should only be to maximize the saving or sustaining of lives and not for other purposes. So this may not be exactly aligned with how you approach your different rationalizations and moral arguments here, but what do you make of that kind of argument or approach, and is it an effective one? Is it aligned with the contents of the approach or the framework that you use in analyzing this question?
Okay, that's a very good question. One of the things I try to address in the egalitarianism chapter is that, and in a subsequent essay that will appear in a forthcoming volume edited by yourself and Doug Noonan, is that when we think about egalitarianism in the arts, it is challenging to find a moral justification for arts funding on the basis of fostering equality. That is a tough hill to climb, because we know what participation rates in the arts are, and we can say that arts policy is simply not the best instrument for trying to address what I realize are vast inequalities in our society relative to the power of other policy instruments that we have at our disposal. So that is one question. Effective altruism essentially might say, well, if we, it says something of the same, which is that, if we do care about altruism in the poor, this is a weak case to make. And of course, Peter Singer once famously wrote an essay, I think in the New York Times, on why would you ever give money to a museum because of this. And so I think that has to be realized, that it's not, egalitarianism questions are often, we can use them to think about how we actually do government funding. But a question we might ask is, well, if you started without an arts council, if you said, well, here's the American or the British or Canadian economies, and they have all these different structures and so on, but we have no arts councils of any kind. It's not a thing anybody's thought of yet. And you said, well, should we start one? It would be very difficult to find an argument on the basis of this will help alleviate inequalities. Mm. That would not be sort of a very strong argument you find. You can find other arguments for it, but that would not be one. It doesn't mean you wouldn't set up the Arts Council. It just means that that's not a good alignment of means and ends in those terms. Other aspects of effective altruism that do come in through the book is in terms of thinking about the future. One of the people who, and I think I talked about this in a workshop a few years ago in this space, one of the people who tries to square the circle of Rawls's opposition to arts funding, but saying, but maybe we could make it work, is Ronald Dworkin, when he said, but what if we think about future generations? And, in all of our allocation decisions now, we should think about, well, what are they going to have in the future? That is a possible argument. Ironic, I've always found it odd for Dworkin, because he is such a committed liberal, but he actually gives a very conservative argument for why we should have funding, namely that it is important that future generations have some sort of foundation of a common idea of this is our rich language, this is our rich cultural heritage, from which they can both enjoy that and create new things out of that, sort of a T.S. Eliot kind of argument. So again, we come back to that. I do take a shot at one effective altruist, Will McManus's book on what we owe the future, just in the very final chapter. It actually came up last week in the news because, of course, Sam Bankman-Fried has been on trial, and he had this crazy quote that he made about Shakespeare, saying, well, how can we say he's the greatest author because he lived at a time when population was really small? So what are the odds that somebody from such a small population would end up being the best writer when we have so many more people now? And Will McManus actually makes a very similar argument, that as long as population keeps expanding, well, arts are just going to keep getting better and better and better. Well, as the kids say, LOL, that's not a very strong argument in terms of, how we can think about development in the arts, that all we need to do is increase population, and out of that will come, thousands of mute Inglorious Miltons will suddenly find their voice. So
I think that relates to Karen's question, which I'll get to in a moment, but Carol has had her hand up. So Carol, how about you ask your question?
Thanks so much. I wanted to return to James's question about the definition of the arts that you're using in this book. Because it seems to me that a broader and more inclusive definition of the arts does not require the same level or the same types of justification that you are asking for. I wonder if your book is sort of more about justifying or the moral foundation for funding the arts that we fund. Because when we look more expansively and inclusively at different forms of arts and culture, the sort of self-evident reason why you would be supporting people's everyday cultural and artistic expressions and creativity are just not that difficult to justify in the same way that supporting more elite and exclusive and class reproducing forms might be. So I wonder if you would respond to that, Michael. That'd be helpful for me to understand the usefulness of what you're presenting and its where its limitations might be.
Okay, thank you, Carol. And that's a really important question. So I'm glad you asked it. I'm not sure I agree with you here, because one of the issues I think is going to come up is that the further and further you broaden what will count as art and what activities in our ordinary lives we will count as art, it doesn't actually, to my mind, make the case for public subsidy of the arts greater, because it still leaves the question of, well, why would you do this? Why would you have state intervention at all in terms of subsidizing the arts at all? You're still making a judgment in terms of this kind of activity is more important than that, and that's why we're going to subsidize it. So you don't get around the fact that you're making judgments. And I can give the example for, one example was, let me use the sort of wild experiment done in some continental European countries of the culture pass. Okay, so the French government says, okay, we're going to give every 18-year-old 300 euros, which is a lot of money to spend on culture, and you can pick, what kind of culture you want to spend it on. So all these kids get the app on their phone, and they go and they say, well, great, I can do it on all these things. And then, as various newspapers reported, in the first year out, over half the money that people spent was on manga. They were all heading to the comic book store and picking up whatever manga they wanted. And then you had this really interesting debate, because there were people who were trying to be very broad-minded and saying, well, it is culture after all, and it was allowed under the scheme. And you had other people saying, well, it's not quite what we meant by culture in the first place. Maybe we should have been more restrictive. But what I found interesting in that debate was that there was still somehow this idea that a culture pass was the very thing, rather than just giving 300 euros to every 18-year-old and saying, go wild. What if you want to use it on train tickets to want to go see a different part of France? What if you want to use it because you're really interested in cooking and you want to get some good cookware for your kitchen to get started on that? But no, they were saying, no, culture is the thing. And so you still end up having to draw a boundary, right? You still end up having to draw a boundary of this gets funded, but that doesn't. There's simply no way around that problem. As you broaden what counts as culture, you still have to answer the question, but why would we use public funds for this, right? Why would we want to do that? And I don't think the question gets easier by saying we're going to expand what we count as art. Now, I'm not completely exclusive. And so in the chapter that I have on a term that's not used much anymore, multiculturalism, I do say that it is important that arts funders recognize that there is not simply one culture and where there are artistic traditions, and especially where they have been neglected or pushed to the side in arts funding before, it's important to take those into account and perhaps even make reparations. I think, to take one example, I think the Canada Council for the Arts has done really admirable work in saying, you know, we've done a terrible job since we were created in the late 50s of how we've treated the art of our Indigenous people. And in fact, we demeaned it. We said it's not really art at all. We didn't fund it. We didn't involve anybody in decision making. And we now realize that was wrong. And this ought to be included, not just as an art form, but also in peer review panels and decision making and how we're going to do this and all these sorts of things. So I don't just say, you know, all funding should be of the symphony orchestra and the Shakespeare Theater. You can include different things, but I don't think there's a strong case, and I think you would have trouble making a strong case for general public subsidy of pop art. I made a joke about Taylor Swift before, but it wasn't entirely a joke. There are some aspects of the arts that truly do fine without public subsidy, and where any state intervention I can only see as doing more harm than good. If we started saying we need to start funding pop singers, we need to start having a grant-making process with peer review panels for television comedy shows or whatever. I don't think you get good outcomes that way. And so I'm gonna stay with what I've got here. I don't think the justification for public funding gets easier. In fact, I think it might get harder as you expand those boundaries.
Just to really quickly follow up, which I did ask permission to do.
And I welcome it.
I think the examples that you give of commercial cultural forms may be important, but particularly in the American context, I think the diversity of art forms and communities that produce expressive work and that need a whole variety of different kinds of support is so expansive and so clearly inequitably supported that it seems almost, I'm not sure the justification of ignoring that whole part, particularly because this has sort of paradigmatic implications. So when you say, this is the kind of art that gets funded, and that's the kind of art that we're worried about justifying, I think it takes for granted a certain point of view that isolates art away from other things, that many, many communities of color just do not see art that way. They see arts and culture as integral to every other thing that would be supported by public policy as anything else. So yes, the Anglo tradition does not see the arts and culture that way. But of course, our culture here in the United States, you make a choice when you characterize our culture that way, that I would argue is not actually appropriate to the US context.
Okay.
So thank you. So Karen had the question of there's also a rich discussion going on in the chat, so thank you all. I love these types of talks that just provoke so much. Karen also had the question about public subsidies for artists. So do these frameworks apply to individuals or just institutions?
It can be individuals. In the United States, for the most part, we have ceased to fund most individual artists. They are, they get up to all kinds of shenanigans that get people upset. We still fund writers in the United States, of course. Other countries do give more funding to artists, but I include artists and arts organizations. And so I think in the economic approach chapter, I do go over sort of, since economists tend to look for positive externalities, I actually divide up what would be the externalities directly associated with individual artists. And then I look to arts organizations as well. But I'm going to use that to launch into what I think is an important point. And this is something that I think I try to get through in the book, but I think it's often missed in these discussions, especially when we come to individual artists. I say I've tried to broaden my approaches beyond economics, but you can't entirely take the economist out of the Rushton. And so one of the things I go back to is Adam Smith. And Adam Smith says, you know, the purpose of the sole purpose of work and production is for consumption. In other words, we go to work, we till our fields, we man the lathe, so that people can have these goods that are produced out of them. That is why we do it. And so when I look to funding of artists, it has to be recognized that the goal is not to make the artist happy. We don't fund a painter because the painter's life will then be better. Obviously, it will. We don't fund the Cleveland Symphony so that each cellist can get a raise or anything like that. We fund the painter, we fund the orchestra because they will make art that will benefit the public in some way. It might only be part of the public, it might be the whole public, it might be for various kinds of reasons that we think people are going to benefit from this, but that's why we do it. And so public funding for the arts is about what do we as non-artists, and I'm very much a non-artist, get from this. It is not for the artist. In the same way that when we use public funds to do a highway upgrade, the purpose of it is not to give higher employment or wages to people who lay down the pavement or drive the steamrollers, right? It is so that we have a better road to drive on. And so I think that's an important thing to realize that I stick with throughout the book, is that that's why we're doing this. That's, you know, that's the only reason for public funding of the arts. Now we can come up with different arguments for why the public benefits from this, and different kinds of philosophies give different kinds of answers to that question. But ultimately, that's the question that they're answering.
Well, I think that's a great segue. There was a question posed to me in the chat about impact and results and instrumental impact. And it's something that I don't think you touch on at all in the book, if I'm correct. But this idea that one of the justifications for public funding is the instrumental impacts that resulted, or that we believe to be result from the arts. How does that argument square with any of these moral arguments that you propose?
Okay, one of the things I discuss in the book is that I actually don't find the instrumental/intrinsic debate very useful. Because it's actually not a helpful way to think about public funding for the arts. From the economist point of view, and here I'll put on my cultural economist hat, the interesting question is, if I go to hear a concert tonight, are there people in my town or elsewhere who do not go to that concert? Are they going to benefit from my going? That is known as a positive externality, and that has big implications for whether we should have public funding. Now, the benefits that I get from going to the concert might be intrinsic. I really love the music. They might be instrumental. People tell me it's good for me to get out more, and it's better for my health, and I'll see some friends there. Those are instrumental benefits. But there's not really an important distinction between, in terms of public funding, my liking the music and it's a good place for me to see friends, and walking to the theater will give me some fresh air, because they're all personal benefits, right? They're all just to me. The benefits to people in the community who don't go to the concert, they might be intrinsic. It might be somebody is sitting at home saying, I love classical music. I really wish I could get out to the concert, but I can't. But I'm really glad Michael Rushton is going. That makes me feel good. Well, that's an intrinsic benefit, but it's an externality. It's an externality. Somebody feels a positive effect from my going, even though it's entirely about the music. Or they might say it's an instrumental benefit, in that they might say, well, this is strengthening our community. This was making us all more empathetic, because we know there's a large literature that says if you consume the arts, you have more empathy. And of course, Rushton might buy a snack and pay for parking, and that has terrific economic impacts somehow. And those are instrumental benefits. So I think that the instrumental intrinsic isn't really the core of the question. The core of the question is, are all of the benefits of the arts going to the people who directly consume it, or are some of the benefits going to others? That's the question to ask, right? That's the public funding question to ask.
Yeah, good distinction. So we have time for one more question from the audience, and then I have the most important question of all to finish with. But
Okay.
Hannah, I see your hand up.
Sure, thank you. I wanted to follow up on Karen's question and just ask if your research has led you to any moral conclusions about how much to pay artists or how much to pay people who work in the arts as professionals, and should they be getting lower amounts or competitive with private, or has your research led you anywhere there? Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. That's a good question. I didn't really go there. I think the way to answer that question is to ask us what kind of funding actually makes a difference. If there's amounts of funding that really don't do anything in terms of they don't really change anybody's ability to create art or ability to bring art to the public, if it doesn't have that effect, then it really wasn't worth doing. It has to be at a magnitude enough where you can say, this has actually made a difference in our community in terms of what we have, in terms of offerings from individual artists, from bigger arts organizations, from festivals and so on. A thing that arts funding, for it to have any meaning at all, it has to do something. It has to make something happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And so I think that's where you look for those threshold numbers. What are amounts of subsidy that are actually going to be meaningful in terms of making something different happen?
Right. So I wanted everybody just to be able to see the cover of the book. There is this bland structure on the cover, not really much going on there other than the fact that it says Opera House. I'm just wondering, where did this picture come from and what led you to choose it to be on the cover of your book?
Okay, that little building, and it looks like just a little red schoolhouse from 100 years ago, but it says Opera House in front. I find this a really interesting public policy in the arts initiative that happened a little over 100 years ago in the state of Indiana. The state legislature said that, well, we have this fairly dispersed population. Indiana has a lot of very small cities dispersed throughout the state because it's primarily agricultural and then manufacturing. And it said, well, each county seat ought to have a building where there can be recitals, where there can be lectures, where there can be displays, so that the public can come and enjoy these things and that they don't have to live in a big city to have all these things. So the legislature actually gave a bit of funding and a bit of leeway for each county to provide one of these little buildings. There's one here in Bloomington. If you're sitting here from Bloomington right now, I believe it is the Princess Theater on Walnut, just north of 6th, which I think is a bar right now and was a Mexican restaurant for a while, but I think that was the original one. The one in Spencer, up the road in Owen County, it's now a movie theater. And the one on the cover of the book is in Mitchell, Indiana, which is a little more than a half hour south of Bloomington. They actually refurbished the building, but I just love the shot. It's just an ordinary sidewalk and a few telephone wires. There's houses and cars parked nearby, and it just says Opera House right in front. So they've preserved this, and it just seemed to capture a lot about this, fairly simple idea of a basic public expenditure for the public good. And so that was why I chose that picture.
Wonderful.
So it's a bit of local content.
Well, thank you, Michael. This was really a pleasant experience. I love being able to grill you. So.
Okay, I thank you all. The questions and especially I'm going to thank people who challenged me on it, because it is a book that demands challenging, and so I am glad for those questions. And my big hope is that people just go out and write more about this, and that this prods people to think more deeply about these issues.
Right. Well,
but thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. And please do come back in 2 weeks to join us to see our next speaker, Brent Lutz, who is the chief economist for the United States Copyright Office, and he will be talking about the economics of copyright policy. So thanks and have a great day, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.